Year 10 and 11, welcome to your analysis of Eva Smith / Daisy Renton from an Inspector Calls in preparation for your AQA English Literature exam. I always like to start with the context of the play, and it is vitally important that we know the context of this play because Priestley uses his play as propaganda. So if we just look at the slide, dead simple. During the 1930s, Priestley became very concerned about the consequences of social inequality in Britain. In 1942, Priestley and others set up a new political party, the Commonwealth Party, which argued for public ownership of land, greater democracy and a new morality in politics. The party merged with the Labour Party in 1945. Priestley was influential in developing the idea of the welfare state, which began to be put into place at the end of the war. He believed that further world wars could only be avoided through cooperation and mutual respect between countries, and so became active in the early movement for a United Nations. Again, vitally important is to understand that Priestley wrote the play in the 1940s, but he set it in 1912. So if we look down the left at society in 1912, the First World War would start in 2 years. The Berlin's optimistic view that there would be no war and that the Titanic wouldn't sink are completely wrong. There were strong distinctions between the upper and the lower classes. Women were subservient to men. All a well-off woman could do was get married. A poor woman was seen as cheap labour. The ruling classes saw no need to change the status quo. Now, if we look down the right-hand side at the 1940s society, the Second World War had ended and people were recovering from nearly 6 years of warfare, danger and uncertainty. Class distinctions had been greatly reduced as a result of both the wars. Also, as a result of the wars, women had earned a more valued place in society because women were helping with the weapon making, remember. And there was a great desire for social change immediately after the Second World War. Clement Attlee's Labour Party won a landslide victory over Winston Churchill and the Conservatives. So the whole purpose of the play is that it is propagandist in support of the Labour Party. That is really, really important. So make sure you understand that J.B. Priestley was trying to gain support for the Labour Party. So he uses his play to do that. He also uses the play to highlight the power of socialism. The idea of socialism basically is that we should all look after each other. The inspector sums it up beautifully at the end of the play when he says, we are all responsible for each other. He also uses the play to highlight the issues of capitalism and the Conservative Party. Now, he uses the Berlins as a symbol of both of those things. So the Berlins sum up capitalism and the Conservative Party and their ideals. And obviously Priestley shows us the issues of the Berlin family, the fact that they are greedy when it comes to money, don't accept responsibility for their actions, where Eva Smith is concerned and what's happened to her. Whereas with the inspector, we see what he's trying to teach them. He's trying to teach them about social responsibility, about looking after each other, and therein lies the propagandist aspect of socialism and support for the Labour Party. Okay? So, who is Eva Smith? Who is Daisy Renton? We've got to ask ourselves if they're the same person and also if they exist at all. That is your interpretation. I can't tell you the right or the wrong answer there. It is what you think, okay? So do you think they're the same person? Do you think they even exist? But in terms of the play, who are these people? Eva Smith is an ordinary working class girl, and Priestley uses her to represent all poor, disadvantaged women. Her parents are dead. We are told that she is pretty a couple of times. She loses all of her jobs. We know that Mr. Burden fires her. We know that Sheila gets her fired. And also her name, Smith. It is the most common name in Britain. She is a symbol of her whole class, and the idea that the whole of the working class was suffering. The whole of the lower classes were suffering in Britain at the time, which is 1912. Also, Priestley actually uses her to contrast some of the characters from the Berlin family. So, as I say, we know she gets fired and Mr. Berlin admits it, and he even admits that she's a good worker. We know that she's pretty enough to make Sheila jealous because Sheila explains that to us. We know she attracts the attention of Gerald and Eric. We know as well that despite all of the problems she was facing and all of the difficulties in her life, she had morals and she had values. Because when Eric steals the money, she refuses to take it because it is stolen. Therefore, she contrasts with the Berlin family, who at the start of the play don't seem to have any morals or any values at all. She is strong enough to demand a fair pay rise. Yes, okay, she does end up at a low point in her life when she has to go to the palace bar and ends up pregnant and committing suicide. But up until then, she seems to be a quite strong, pretty girl who sticks to her values. Overall, J.B. Priestley uses her as a way of making the Berlins realise what effect they are having on people, to make the Berlins realise the effect of their actions. And it is hugely important that we don't know whether it's the same girl, that we don't know whether he shows the same photograph to different characters, because, as Eric points out, it does not matter whether it's the same person or not, because they are still to blame for what they have done. They should still take responsibility for their actions. So Priestley isn't necessarily telling us about the death of a girl here. What he's doing is he's sending out this message of socialism, this message that we should take responsibility for other people, regardless of social status, regardless of money, of wealth. Also, overall, Eva Smith is a victim of society at the time, the selfishness of the Berlins. Remember, this is an unseen exam, so you won't have the text with you. So it is important that we try to remember some quotations. I don't expect you to remember the really detailed ones, but remembering how to paraphrase them will help. So, for instance, I've just got some important quotes on the next two slides here. So we are told she's a lively, good-looking girl. Now, again, that is important because, as I said earlier, she is good-looking enough or pretty enough to make Sheila jealous, and she does attract the attention of both Gerald and Eric. Yes, it's Gerald who tries to protect her from another man, remember, in the palace bar. Mr. Berlin, infuriatingly for the audience, tells us she's a good worker and he's fired her. And therein lies the injustice of capitalism and a society that runs that way, that he decides to fire her that because she's a good worker, because she wanted to be paid fairly. Those two quotations, because they're short, I do think you should try your best to remember. Here's a longer quotation which explains what's happened to her. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. Look at the adjective young. Again, it does still portray her as very innocent. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, burnt her inside out, of course. If we're going to remember anything there, burnt her inside out, of course. Remember the way the inspector describes her gruesome death really unsettles Sheila, doesn't it? Because she doesn't like to hear what's happened to her. So again, when we're talking about the character of Eva Smith, to commit suicide in that way, as an audience, we realise that she must have been so desperate. Remember, she's been turned away from the charity. She must be desperate to do this. I don't see why we should have been sacked just because... I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she'd a bit more spirit than the others. So again, as I said in my video about Eric, he defends her. Eric defends Eva Smith. Well, I don't know why she should have been sacked. Mr. Berlin remembers trying to make an example of somebody, isn't he, really, to send a warning to the other workers who had protested. And Eva Smith obviously is the person he fires. Again, she had a bit more spirit than the others. Not only is she pretty, but we can assume that she's got a really strong personality. And that's probably why he chose her. But look at Eric as well. Eric doesn't understand why she's being fired, which once again presents the injustice of everything that's happened to her. If she'd been some miserable, plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it. but she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. I couldn't be sorry for her. I mean, what a horrible description from Sheila. If she'd been some miserable, plain little creature, I wouldn't have done it. So Sheila's jealousy here is shown. She's jealous of what she looks like. She's jealous of her, and uses her social position as one of the Berlins to have her fired. Once again, Priestley highlighting the issues of society at the time, the issues of social class, and the fact that they in 1912 was obviously a huge divide between the upper classes and the working class. A couple more key quotations then. She looked young and fresh and charming and altogether out of place down there. So we're told when Gerald sees her in the Palace Bar that she doesn't really fit in with those types of women. So again, it's the idea that she does stand out, doesn't she? And that is why both Gerald and Eric are attracted to her. Look again at the adjectives: young and fresh, charming. So so far they've kind of all described her positively, haven't they? Because Mr. Berlin said she was a good worker. Sheila said she was pretty and could look after herself, and Gerald describes her like this. Okay? As if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Now, again, it's this this idea of social class, isn't it? A girl of that sort. I mean, look at that description of Eva Smith. And there's a huge generalisation here that suggests girls of a lower class would never refuse money because they're so desperate. Again, awful thing to assume, and it highlights the morals, as I said earlier, that Eva Smith has. She won't take the money because it's stolen, whereas Eric will steal the money. So there's a huge difference between the Berlins and Eva Smith. So again, you've got to ask yourself, what is Priestley telling us about the lower classes there then? That they had morals even though they didn't have money? Potentially. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. Again, this claim that she couldn't feel anything for Eric, obviously this is Mrs. Berlin, isn't it? Because of what position she was in, because of her class. Again, it comes down to social class all of the time, doesn't it? With Mrs. Berlin particularly, a girl in her position. So Mrs. Berlin, we know, takes the hump immediately because this girl Eva claims she's Mrs. Berlin. It's almost as if a girl of that class isn't allowed to have feelings for someone of the upper class. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy and friendliness. I mean, if there's ever a sad quotation to sum up Eva Smith, I mean, that's it, isn't it? Look, alone, friendless, penniless, desperate. I think those, if we can try and remember those words for our exam, I think they are pivotal to describe her last moments, because obviously, as I said earlier, to commit suicide in that particular way, or at all, but more so in that way, she must have been desperate, mustn't she? And we know she goes to the charity as the kind of last straw, and isn't greeted with friendliness, isn't greeted with advice or sympathy, is merely sent away because Mrs. Berlin thinks she's being rude, because Mrs. Berlin takes her social class and her reputation very, very seriously. And herein lies the problem, isn't it? That the Berlins don't value the things in life that J.B. Priestley thinks people should value, which is each other. And then obviously the big quote about Eva Smith comes from the inspector at the end. One Eva Smith is gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. I did tell you that she is symbolic of poor, disadvantaged women in society, that her name is the most common in Britain, so she is a representation of her class, which is the lower / working class, isn't it? And therein lies Priestley's message, that there's millions of people suffering because of a system that works on conservative ideals, capitalist views, and a huge divide in the social classes. If we have a look at an example exam question, and then I'll talk you through a potential plan to answer the question. So, how does Priestley present Eva Smith's role in An Inspector Calls? 30 marks. 804 is 4 marks. Write about how she is described by other characters, what she represents, the methods Priestley uses to present her. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a potential plan. So our introduction should focus on the social and historical context of the play. Explain when it was written, in the 1940s, but that it was set in 1912. Explain the entire purpose of the play as propaganda in support of socialism and the Labour Party. And explain Eva Smith's role in the play, which is that she is a symbol of the working class in 1912. Then we should go into more detail about Eva Smith. So basically summing up who she is. She's an ordinary working class girl. Use a quotation to prove it. Explain then how she is a symbol of the working class. She loses her jobs. Use a quotation there about her losing the job with Mr. Berlin or Sheila. She is penniless and homeless. I gave you that quotation about her being penniless and desperate and things like that. She is a victim of a selfish conservative society. For spelling their keywords, conservative, society and symbol. Okay, on to the next paragraph. Then we should start with Mr. and Mrs. Berlin and their treatment of Eva Smith. So explain why she loses her job with Mr. Berlin. Again, use a quotation. Why she is sent away from the charity by Mrs. Berlin. Again, if we can, paraphrase a quotation, or if you can remember one, brilliant. Explain again how desperate she is when she goes to Mrs. Berlin. And the older generation's opinion of her. Remember, Mrs. Berlin says, girls of that class. Keywords for spelling: generation, opinion, charity. Then it's on to Sheila and Eric's treatment of her. So Sheila's reaction to Eva Smith. Again, I gave you that quotation about how she explains that if she was a plain miserable little creature, she wouldn't have had her fired, but she was pretty and could look after herself. The influence Sheila has over her position. So the fact that she's one of the Berlins, she uses her power and her wealth to have Eva fired. Eric's relationship with her. Again, he says she's pretty, she's a good sport, things like that. And then finally, we should say that Sheila and Eric feel very guilty about their actions. They feel responsibility. There's quite a few quotations you can get for that. Keywords: guilt, generation, influence, position. And then finish with Gerald and a conclusion. So Gerald's role in her only happiness. Use a quote, okay, because he explains quite a lot, does Gerald, about their affair. The inspector's final speech about Eva Smith, massive quotation, which is why we should finish with it. Remember, I just gave you it before. One Eva Smith is gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, etc., etc. And overall sum up her role in the play. Yeah, to show how the Berlins treat people, how they use their position and wealth to mistreat people. The issues of social class and the lesson of social responsibility. Again, keywords there: happiness, Goole, it is vital we don't spell characters' names wrong, social class, and responsibility. I hope this video has been useful. If you do need any more of my videos, just type Stacey Reay into YouTube. That's STACEY, and Reay is REAY. And good luck in your literature exam.